Welcome to video 6. Today we will be attaching the back to the body. We will be working on inlays for the fingerboard and head plate, and we will be working on getting the binding channels cut. We will also be binding the fingerboard and polishing it to a wonderful shine, which you will see at the end of the video. As always, thanks for watching. So I trimmed a little bit of the excess top away with a bandsaw. The next step is to go over the inside with a little bit of sandpaper and make sure the glue squeeze out is taken care of. It can mess with the sound waves bouncing off in between. I'm going to give the braces another sanding, and then we'll actually be ready to install the electronics. So I've attached the transducers close to where the bridge is going to be, just to the sides of it. Hopefully it's a good spot. It's going to be very difficult to get in and move these once the mandola is put together. I've sized the end jack for the thickness of the tail block. That'll sit inside. We can't install that until we actually put the hardware on. But what I'll do is I will feed it out through the sound hole, take the nuts off, use a string to feed it out through the hole that I have to drill. I also need to enlarge the tailpiece, which I will do at this point. So like we did on the top, I'm going to start these notches with a saw cut. Take the rasp and take a look, see how that fits. Then we'll vacuum out the inside and glue the back on. Got to take off some of this strip. It's way off on that guy. The last thing I did on the back is I just burned in my logo so you can see it through the sound hole. Now I'm going to wipe down the edges with acetone to get any oils off, and then we'll be ready to apply glue. You got it. We'll put the rest of these clamps on and let it dry overnight. Taking this opportunity of working on some inlays. I've got some yellow pearl, and I use some spray adhesive to hold my template on. Jeweler's saw with a fine blade, and we're just going to kind of cut this out. Got this V-notch. Saw sits in here. It gives plenty of support to the pearl. And I'll continue cutting. There's the first inlay that we cut out, the letter P, and I'll just touch it up with some needle files to make everything smooth, and then we'll be able to inlay this in the head plate. And I'm also making some inlays for the fingerboard, kind of just an odd shape. So I've laid out the headstock, and I've got my tuner holes positioned. I've laid on my inlays that I cut out. I've tried to mimic somewhat of the shape of the instrument Mandola with that edge and then this edge to mimic those cutouts. I've used my tuner template guide to lay out the tuner holes, mark the center line, figured out the widths, and it looks like to get this shape and everything will fit, I don't even have to add any wings to my neck, so I'm going to make it pretty easy on myself. What I'll do now is I will start marking these inlays and get out my Dremel and start cutting the pockets for them. This is the result of the inlays on the headstock. I used super glue to hold them in place, and then I took some epoxy and mixed it with a black dye to fill in any gaps around the edges. Once that's dry, we'll sand it smooth and hopefully get some good results. I'm ready to do the inlays on the fingerboard. I'm actually going to start with the 12th fret. I've marked approximately where the edges of the fingerboard are going to be. I have the center line, and then I've got the mark centered between the center line and the edge of where the fingerboard is going to be. And I will inlay my pockets, and I'm going to see how that goes. If I don't really like the way this is coming out, then I may just do no markers on the rest of the frets. But give it a shot. Okay, so what I've done here is I have cut the top away from the dovetail. I just used the saw to cut down to the sides, connected it, used the utility knife to cut it off flush, and I used the chisel to smooth out and make sure everything, the sides and the top, all line up with that dovetail cut. I've also taken a trim bit in my router and trimmed off all the edges around the top and the back, and we're ready to actually start fitting up the dovetail. So what I've done is I have marked the dovetail out on the neck blank, and I'm just going to take a Japanese saw and I'm going to hand cut it a little oversized, and then we'll use files and sandpaper to fit the dovetail into the body of the guitar. Now I'm working on fitting the neck, and it's just definitely a work a little bit. I've used rasp and files to get it very close. I'm down to sandpaper just to get this so it's a nice snug fit, making sure that the center line continues to be down the center. I've also had to cut away some of the end of the neck so that it would fit into the curve. But we'll continue these trials until we get a nice set into the neck with enough room for glue. So after a bit of tweaking, we've got a dovetail that's fit. The neck is now sitting flush. When we put, sorry about that. When we put the fingerboard in place, we've got a good angle. I've set up my Dremel to cut the binding. I did a test cut and I made sure that the binding is going to be slightly above and slightly proud of the sides, and we're going to try cutting the binding channels. I'm going to start with the back, because if I mess up badly I can hide that a little better. Got the binding channels routed on both sides. Next step will be to bend the binding so that it'll wrap around. I've taken the bloodwood and I've drawn a center line, and then I've drawn a slight V shape, 1/2 inch at the top, 3/8 of an inch at the bottom, and then we'll cut that out, fair it up with some planes, and then we'll cut a matching groove on the back of the mandola. Okay, so I've got it cut out, and I'm just going to align it with the center lines on the piece with the center lines on the instrument. And then I'm going to use a knife to mark the edges. We'll use a saw to cut those edges, and then a chisel to move out the waste. So the piece has been fitted, the veneers are cut. All it's left to do is just to glue it in place. We'll just do that with some Titebond. At this point, I'm finishing up the binding channels. Any place where a corner comes together, I have to put binding to hide that seam. So I've got a couple of channels done. I've got 2 more to go on these ends, and the way I do it is I use the binding as a guide. I lay it on the joint about where it needs to go, and I just mark the ends with a knife. And I take a ruler and I connect the lines. Then I use a saw to cut the edge straight, and I'm just going to cut the thickness of the side. Be careful not to go too deep, or you'll see it from the back and or the top. And then I just take a chisel and I'll pare this out. Now that I've radiused the fretboard, one of the things I prefer to do is I prefer to bind the fretboard before I glue it onto the neck, which is kind of nerve-wracking. So I have to do some calculations because I need to make this fretboard narrower by the thickness of the bindings. So we're going to use curly maple bindings. They happen to be, the 2 bindings together are 3/16 of an inch thick. So my nut width up here is going to be 1 1/4. So if I take the 1 1/4 and I subtract 3/16, we get 1 1/16. Double check that. Yep, 1 1/16 is what we get. If I divide that by 2, I get 17/32, which is what I have to do each side of the center line. Alright. At the 12th fret, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put my ruler on the 1/2 And on this time I'm going to go 3/4 to either side. Alright, then I will connect those marks and cut them off a little shy, and I'll use a hand plane to get it down to the line. With details this fine, you definitely want to use a knife. It makes a much finer line. Pencil, you can actually make it too wide, you can cut it too short. So I've rough cut it on the bandsaw, and I've planed one side. And what I'm doing is I'm just planing down to where that knife mark is. I'm almost there. I'll probably be able to sand the rest of that away. I'm getting ready to bind the fingerboard. And what I've done is I've cut strips of flame maple to fit the sides, and I've mitered the ends. And then I've cut a piece that will cover the end. And I've mitered that connection, so they'll be nice and neat when it comes together. I'm just going to use some tight bond glue. That should hold it fine. So there it is. I've used binding tape to hold the binding on, and we'll let that dry, and we'll be able to start finishing up the neck, gluing the fingerboard on, shaping the neck, glue the headstock plate on, and we're on our way for that. Okay, the binding is now glued on, and what I've done is I've taken a hand plane and I've just kind of brought the edges down close to the fingerboard. And what I'll do is I'll take my sanding block and I will make sure the radius matches with the binding. That didn't take too much, so now I'll just polish it up, and we'll be just about ready to insert the truss rod and glue the fingerboard onto the neck. Alright, so we sanded it to 800 grit, and then I polished it up with micro mesh up to 12,000 grit. You can actually see the ebony is actually got a little bit of a shine to it. When you get up into those high grits, ebony is kind of a self-polishing wood. But I think that came out pretty nice.